We do have three very distinguished speakers coming up, and including our Minister of Defense, Prabowo Subianto, and also General Wesley Clark, and also Gaurav. I mean, wow, what can I say? I mean, Fred, Atlantic Council. I'm speechless. I mean, what an amazing lecture we've just heard there. And I'm just, it's incredible, the breadth and the substance. And I think we can all agree that we learned a lot from Minister Prabowo's lecture. And I think his own Atlantic Council forum. I mean, this is encapsulated everything about food security. And what can I say? Well, I hope he's coming back to join the session. And I've been asked to stall for time here, so forgive me. Things have been very weird somewhat this morning. Anyway, food security. We've listened to the keynotes this morning, and we know that food security, global food security, is very much present-day challenges. And of course, our food supply system, the entire global food system rests on the premise of global security. If there is a disruption in the global security, it will affect food security. And the reason being is that we're not such a globalized world. We're so interdependent with one another, particularly for our food supply. There's not one single country in the world that can actually feed their own people without importing food, without getting food supply from other countries. And then once this supply chain is disrupted, obviously, this is a real threat. And we have had terrible, terrible global shocks recently, what with the pandemic, which actually brought the world to a halt. We've had, we are in the middle of a war in the Ukraine, which is obviously affecting food supply and also trade. And we are also in the middle of an global economic crisis, rising food prices, inflation, energy crisis, and of course, these are global challenges that need to be resolved on a global basis. Global problems need global solutions. And I think this G20 forum, this G20 summit, is a very, very good opportunity for world leaders to actually gather together and find solutions for these problems. Now, I would now like to invite my three panelists to the stage. I'll start with General Wesley Clark, Chairman and CEO of Wesley K. Clark and Associates, a consulting firm. And General Clark is, big hands, please. How are you, sir? Please take a seat. And General Clark, of course, welcome to Bali, welcome to Indonesia. General Wesley Clark is a former NATO Supreme Allied Commander of Europe and a retired four-star general. And it's interesting when we talk about food security, we are turning to our military experts to help solve some of the problems. Once again, welcome, sir. And our next speaker, Minister of Defense of the Republic of Indonesia, the man of the moment, Minister Prabowo Subianto. Hello, sir. How are you? I just want to say, very impressive. Like I said, I was telling Fred and our friends from the Atlantic Council, I mean, I'm speechless. That was a really good, long lecture. But I also would like to remind you, sir, 2024 is still, 2 years away. Okay. Last but not least, we've listened to his keynote speech before, very impassioned speech. Gaurav Srivastava, founder of Gaurav and Sharon Srivastava Family Foundation, also chairman of various groups such as Harvest Commodities, Paramount Energy and Commodities, and Unity Resources Group. Gaurav, thank you for joining us again. And let's have a big hands, everybody, for our speakers. Okay, Minister Prabowo wants to have a...
No, it's okay.
Do you want them some water?
No, I have my own special coffee.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Coffee makes me, think.
Okay, we have a coffee for the minute. How about you, General? Would you like anything to drink?
I'm good.
This is going to be a very long conversation. I thought I'd warn you. This will be probably another hour of conversation, if you don't mind me. It's not every day we have star generals addressing us. So we really do need to take advantage of this. Okay, once we've done with the coffees and everything, let's start with you, if you don't mind, Minister. Let me start with General Clark. After hearing your incredible lecture, we learned a lot, obviously. Just your thoughts on the food security. I mean, General Clark, you were the former, NATO Allied Commander for Europe, and there's obviously some of the things that was mentioned. The idea of food security is very much tied with global security, with hard security. And just your thoughts on our minister's speech, and also how do these two interlink in your perspective?
So first of all, I think Indonesia is really setting a very, very high standard for approaching the issue of food security. And I'm very impressed by the technology, by the work on cassava especially. And this is the way we have to move forward, just like we discovered fish farming about 30 or 40 years ago, and it's spread around the world. Cassava may be the miracle, carb of the 21st century. And I think Indonesia's got a leading role in this, so I think that's really impressive. I think when you look at food security, I agree with what Minister Prabowo has said. It is about more than food, it's about water, it is about energy. I do think we have to be sure we've got the right balance. When we talk about food security, it's about availability, it's about affordability, those things, but it's also about taste. Mm-hmm. Everybody grows up with a comfort food, and tastes change over time. Now, my wife, her comfort food is a baked potato. I don't care that much for baked potatoes, but she likes it. I like spaghetti and meatballs. That's my comfort food. People have these, it's partly what you grow up with, it's partly changing tastes as you mature. But we have to take account of expectations that people have. And the protein map that you showed, Minister Prabowo, was really interesting to me, because when you look at people in Africa and you look at the amount of protein they can get, the amount of calories they can get, of course, that's the first thing you go with. Yep. But when these people come to London sometimes, or Paris, they might be looking for McDonald's. And so it is about expectations, it's about availability, it's about affordability. I think we have to harness the best of government leadership and private sector leadership in this space. I think what I've learned in my, I studied economics of underdevelopment at Oxford. Mm-hmm. I looked at it in Vietnam. I worked it in, as best I could, in Bosnia, and looked at how they could recover. And for the last 22 years, I've traveled around the world and looked at countries. Look, you have to use the profit motive. Mm-hmm. It's just like what Minister mentioned about cassava, and this man who has engineered the best way to do it, has to be profit in it. So it's the balance between government leadership and vision and the private sector picking up the step, having the right incentives and signals to unleash creativity and technology.
Okay, so the partnership was obviously very, very important between government and the private sector. But let me just put it back to, food nutrition obviously is very, very important. And but let's frame it back to food security. As we know, with what's happening in the war in Ukraine, I mean, even Indonesia, we were affected, because we still import a lot of wheat, for example, and fertilizers. General Clark, what would you see as the biggest challenge? What is the state of our food security at the moment with what's going on in the world, and your own definition of food security? Because we are completely interdependent when it comes to, the food system is very global. And then once you have these blockages, and once the supply side is disrupted, I mean, how can we mitigate that? And where do you see, the challenges of food security?
Well, I think we have,
as a global security.
Look, we have to elevate consideration of food security. It's grown in importance each year and each decade, really. But in order to import things that countries need, they have to export. And governments have to help set the incentives for this. So if Indonesia wants to import, let's say, cell phones and electronics from China or the United States or someplace, then how does it get paid for? And all of this has created, in the area of food, this incredibly complex network. And so it becomes something that what COVID has taught us, what the Ukraine war has taught us is, this must be a higher priority in all international discussions. We've got to strengthen these supply chains, listen to what our people need all over the world, and then governments have to work together to meet those needs.
And just on the global security side of it, I mean, obviously, if we have global security problems, it would impact the food security, vice versa. And we have, for example, the climate change issues, and sometimes in the future, if not already, the fight for resources and diminishing resources will be a big problem as the world is trying to feed, over 8 billion people. And the other thing is that we have a very unequal world. In some areas of the world, like you mentioned, Gaurav, we have oversupply of food, and in some parts of the world, the people go to bed hungry. How much of a threat do you think is food security to global security, especially seeing that what we need is global stability in order to get food security?
Well, I think what we are experiencing is one of these moments in history where humankind goes up or down. We have 8 billion people. We're in an incredibly complicated world. We still have old aspirations, old ideas, like some people think of the world as a chessboard. This is my country, that's your country, I want your country. We have to get rid of these old ideas of nationalism and move together toward a new understanding of our responsibilities for humanity. It's a step-by-step process. It's a generational process. And along the way, we've got to let go of some of the anger and hurt from previous generations. This is true in Europe, it's true in Africa, it's true in Asia, and it's true in my country. We've got to look toward the future. There's incredible technology opportunities, so it's a make it or break it time for humanity.
Is food security a real threat to global security?
Right. Well, food security has been brought to the fore by the war in Ukraine. So this is the moment, as Fred Kemp was saying yesterday, we've got a crisis. Use it. Make something different out of the way the world is structured today. We've had the Food and Agricultural Organization for 70 years. It's great. We have the World Food Program. It's fine. Now, look at the current situation and let's move forward. What's the next step we need? How do we harness the strengths of government, the vision of government, with the initiative and technologies of the private sector? This should be a principal issue as Fred was saying earlier, at the G20, and we hope they'll really tackle it.
Gaurav, I mean, let's pick up on that. Your idea, what is food security, the definition of food security? Where are we now? Are we at the critical, junction when food security is threatening our global security? And also, like you also mentioned in a very impassioned, keynote speech about, putting every child should not go hungry anywhere around the world. So how do you see this?
I think it's one thing to talk about these global ideas, but at the end of the day, what matters is what we are doing back home. And being in conflict areas, you start understanding that food and energy and oil and water, these are national security issues. For far too long, they have been considered not to be. And I think that narrative has to change. Given today the conflict in Ukraine, given today the COVID-19 pandemic, given where we just came from, I think this thing has been exasperated in our face. Indonesia, which has several hundred million people, they cannot be...
We have 275 million.
275 million. I don't know the exact number. That's why I didn't want to quote.
Let's hope we don't have 700 million people. That would be a lot of mouths.
I said several hundred.
Okay.
But the point is that there are so many people, and the choices are they need food to eat. They need to fill their cars with gas. And the choices they are being asked to make is should they to take sides in a conflict. And I think it goes back to what the minister said, is this policy of remaining as a nation that is neutral and cares about Indonesia first. I think it's important. And I think while it is really important to focus on global issues, it is also important to understand that the issues are local. Because if there is lack of food, it is cause for serious security issues. And the conversations that are now being had back home in the United States, I think a lot of those conversations have to be in that direction. It is also important to remember that the government is not the one who is buying and selling oil or buying and selling food. It is traders. It is private businesses. And I think it requires industry, requires thought leaders, requires government to work together in conjunction with traders to see what works, not impose policies that ultimately do not work. And that's what I think.
So it's very important, the partnership between the government and the private public-private
partnership.
But I think the important point is also because we are so globalized, we're so interdependent for our food supply. Our whole global food system is so entwined. So how do you see this going forward for countries to actually not only just increase their resilience, but within the countries themselves, there's inequality when it comes to access to affordable, nutritious food. What is the best way to address it? Because it's not just an international or global issue, but it's also within the national itself. There is great inequality when it comes to food security.
There is a short-term issue, and then there are long-term issues. I think the short-term issues which need to be addressed is how do you deal with this imbalance? And yesterday we were talking at a round table, and we discussed ways of setting up special licensing programs to be able to work together and allow trade to flow. And the other point is, at the end of the day, country needs to be self-sustainable. And in several conversations with the minister, his key idea of making Indonesia independent, taking issues that are security, whether it is defense, whether it is food, or whether it is energy, and making sure they are independent is key. And so I think there is a short-term objective, which we look by working on this program, and then the long-term objective is creating self-sustainability. That's what I think.
Minister Prabowo, and actually Indonesia for the last couple of years, we didn't import rice. We actually got an award from the International Rice Research Institution for rice self-sufficiency, but we do still import other things, like, for example, wheat and fertilizer. Just, just very quickly, I mean, we know what you talked about the strategy of Indonesia, creating a food resilience, national resilience, self-sufficiency. But given that Indonesia has a G20 presidency, now what would you actually like to see, the concrete outcomes from this summit when it comes to food security and creating global food security for everybody?
I think when you noticed the remarks of the speakers before me, also my remarks, I mentioned that there is food insecurity problem, but this problem has been compounded by, as I mentioned, population explosion, climate change, and geopolitical conflict. Climate change needs political wisdom and leadership from all countries. Population explosion needs wisdom, leadership, courage from the national elites. But geopolitical conflict, as I mentioned, needs statesmanship, needs leaders with a historical vision and a realistic approach. I think this is what we hope from the G20. We are very happy. We hear that President Xi Jinping of China and President Biden of the United States will meet. This is I think, a very optimistic event. By meeting, by communication, by interaction, these two global powers must show global leadership, global statesmanship, global wisdom. So this is our hope from the G20. So the problems of food security, hunger, is a current, a clear and present danger because we understand 300 million people are already starving, basically. Another 500 million on the verge of starvation. But this is all related to geopolitical reality. We understand 30% of wheat comes from Ukraine and Russia. We understand potash, phosphate is a resource very scarce. Fertilizer dependent on potash, dependent on phosphate. So, yes, you asked me what we hope from the G20. We hope statesmanship, wisdom to overcome this.
Okay, the G20 itself, we come in a very, very challenging sort of environment, not just because it's post-pandemic, but there's a war in the Ukraine, a global economic crisis and inflation, and of course, tension between China and the US, for example. So it's, and of course there is a Russia situation, but how optimistic are you that world leaders can actually sit down, with that wisdom and statementship that you're talking about? And the other thing is Indonesia. This is our presidency. What can we offer as a country, to address and also to maybe, facilitate the path to global food security as well as global security?
Okay, in my opinion, there are, let us say, optimistic goals, idealistic goals. There are also realistic and modest goals. I prefer to have realistic and modest goals. Indonesia, in my opinion, our contribution to the international geopolitical situation is that we succeed in making or taking care of our own house. We must keep our own house in order. Indonesia needs peace, stability, and with peace, stability, we can provide solutions. As I said in my presentation, that with a little bit of investment, with a little bit of rearranging some of priorities, we can be the breadbasket of the world. This is not something impossible. This is mathematics. We have already 80 million degraded forests. We must take care of this. With our planning agency calculating 16 million hectares, if we convert this, this can be the breadbasket of the world. So we can be a solution to the world. Number two, energy. We have to go to renewable, clean energy, green energy, to cut down global warming. That's number two. This, in my opinion, realistic. We take care of our own house. We have peace, prosperity, smart investments. We can be the source of protein to the world, source of calories to the world. That is our contribution. In the real sense, we are non-aligned. We are friendly with all the major powers. So, we can be the intermediary. We can promote dialogue and friendship. So I think, in my opinion, that is our, let us say, modest goals and idealistic goals.
Yeah, and this is also an opportunity for Indonesia to showcase what we have and what we're doing, as you very well displayed in this morning's lecture. Now, General Clark, your thoughts, please. Do you agree? What kind of leadership can Indonesia, give in this circumstances, and also for the U.S. as being the global security power? What can the U.S. do in order to promote global food security and make sure that everything's in?
Well, I think the United States can do several things. Now, we're going to hear later from some American experts on this, and so I don't want to say that I'm an expert on this, but I have looked at it, and I think, there's the role of the American dollar. And so we have to be very aware in the United States that when we use interest rates to deal with domestic American inflation, it has worldwide consequences. I know we are sensitive to that, but we just have to remain sensitive to it, because countries all over the world rise and fall based on how the Federal Reserve System responds to, in some cases, U.S. domestic economic concerns. So that's the first thing. Secondly, I think the United States has done a remarkable job with the technology of agriculture for things like row crops. So I've done a lot of work with the corn farmers in the United States, and you look at the productivity of corn. Now I'm going to use the term acre instead of hectare. There's about 2.5 acres to a hectare. But back when I was growing up, if you got maybe 60, 80 bushels of corn per acre, you were a great farmer in Iowa. In the 1990s, we were up to 90 bushels. Now the average in the recent years has been 170, 180 bushels of corn per acre. And in some cases, we're getting 350 bushels of corn per acre. Why is this? A combination of factors. It's private sector, farmer ingenuity, government leadership in terms of agricultural extension. So I think if we look at these principles and try to help countries all over the world, with technology, some financing to get it started, sharing our systems on how we look at farmland, how we evaluate its need for nutrition, how we use what's called precision agriculture, taking advantage of GPS to know for each meter of land what exactly are the nutrients that are needed for each crop. If we look at some of the Israeli technologies on drip irrigation, for example, we can do amazing things. And so I think the United States has to lead. But I think the United States has to be very careful in doing this because we have a spirit of generosity in America, but we have something called Public Law 480, which enables us to take surplus U.S. agricultural commodities and ship them abroad in times of need as a measure of relief.
Yep.
Sometimes in doing that, we've actually undercut domestic agriculture in those countries that have been the beneficiaries. So I think we have to be careful. You know, it's what the old joke is, if you are in bed with an elephant and it turns over, you can be crushed. And so the United States, for starting really 100 years ago, became the elephant in world finance in so many areas and in food. So we have to be very careful about this because, as Minister Prabowo is saying, there's so much potential in Indonesia, in Nigeria, in DRC, elsewhere in the world. We don't have to rely on row crops in the United States. So we've got to use our leadership wisely.
Okay, well, just very quickly, what would you like to see the outcome of this G20? What concrete results, maybe what, maybe agreement or, what kind of things would you like?
Well, I think what we'll see is already in President Biden's talking points, he's elevated the issue of food security. And one of the things we're going to do from this conference, I hope, is give talking points to the White House so that we get further intensification of this focus on food security. It really is a fundamental. And I think the White House is coming to understand this. It's not something about getting farmers to vote for a particular political party, so therefore you've got to be nice in Iowa. It's much bigger than this. And in the United States, we're fortunate because we don't really have to import food. We do like shrimp, get some of it from here, and tuna, but we don't have to. It's a matter of taste. So in the American discussions, we've misunderstood and underestimated the issue of food security.
Yep.
We have to change our appreciation of priorities.
And, okay, Gaurav, I mean, the General mentions about innovation, technology. Obviously, food security, it's important to have innovation as well as technology, and more importantly, actually, is to energize people to care about food production. What are your solutions to achieving greater food security by strengthening, for example, the farmers, or involving the young people, women, and all sectors of society to focus on this?
Now, I was talking to one of my friends from Africa, and they mentioned that the U.S. is kind of the head of the kite. And once there is turbulence at the head of the kite, the effect is felt all the way at the back, and there is a big lag that happens. It's important to understand that for the reasons that we have been the elephant that turned left or right, the reasons are we need to be really careful and work together and understand that working with our partners like Indonesia and with other nations is the way to build alliances. By providing maybe financing through institutions like DFC, working with policymakers, and we have had several conversations. General Clark and I have several conversations with folks at the White House, folks in Congress and Senate, on these critical issues as to the role that the U.S. can play. And it's important to understand that we cannot put countries like Indonesia in that impossible spot to make a choice. Because the realities of what we are facing back in the US and the realities here in Indonesia or other countries are too separate. And and the basic sustenance needs of working together is essential. The war in Ukraine is an essential conversation to talk about. And I was in New York right around the time when we had the Citizens Award on October 19. And I had conversations with one of the members from the UN. And they showed, and she told me of this large discrepancy between the support that goes to the issue of Ukraine and what's happening in Africa, what's happening in Asia. The value of human life is the same, whether it is a child in Ukraine, or whether it's a child in America, child in Africa, or child here. It's all the same. And the conversation that behooves us today is how do you create a program that prioritizes food security, energy security, and national security as one issue. And hopefully we will be able to achieve that with
and this is what you like to see come out of from this G20 summit. Okay, we've run out of time, but let me just ask a final question to Minister Prabowo. Or maybe you'd like to read your note first. All right. In your presentation, I mean, there's a lot of gloom and doom about, the threat of nuclear war. I just want to ask how, how critical is it? I mean, do you think there will be soon, at some point, wars due to climate change and when food supply gets disrupted and when, people are fighting for diminished food resources, energy resources, water resources? Is this something that, in your... Do you visualize, do you foresee this is something that is of a threat that keeps you awake at night?
Of course, I basically, deep down in me, I am an optimist. Yeah, but as someone who has to deal with security, defense, we have to deal with reality. And of course, our reference are to the players, the big players. So when I hear very senior US former military leaders saying they are worried about nuclear war, when I hear many strategic thinkers like Professor Kissinger, Henry Kissinger, when I hear very important academics whose life is about studying geopolitical conflict, like Professor Mersheimer or Professor Jeffrey Sachs, or many of the leaders of the world powers, when they talk that they are worried about nuclear conflict, then I'm worried, because we are basically we don't see the logic of a major world conflict in this time and age. Ideology-wise, every country can choose their own way to prosperity. Every country has their own right. The West have been very successful in democracy, but some other countries have succeeded. You cannot deny that China has succeeded in their economic growth. They have succeeded in eliminating extreme poverty. We cannot hide this. We cannot denigrate this. So, the success of the West, yes, but we have to see the success of China and the aspirations of other countries. Brazil, Nigeria, South Africa. So what I'm saying is that I base my assessment on the assessments of the big powers, of the strategic thinkers of the big powers.
Okay.
When they say they are worried, well, I think it's also logical that I'm worried.
Okay, not to end on the pessimistic note. Thank you very much, Minister Prabowo, for that remark. Well, let's hope this G20 summit will be, the path to global collaboration, will be the way to world peace, because this is what we all want, right? Okay, big hands, please. General Clark, Minister Prabowo, and also Gaurav, thank you very much for an interesting fire chat side. And I would now like to give the program back to the next session. Thank you.